to the typeset. Mayra and I are here today with the first discussion video of the Arriba Allende project. And if you're just tuning in, we're reading this book, Island Beneath the Sea by Isabel Allende, in installments over the month of April, and doing discussion videos that we're posting every Monday from now until May 2nd. And we'll put the schedule in the description box below.
And I just wanted to give a brief background on both Allende and Island Beneath the Sea. So Allende is a Chilean-American author who incorporates magical realism in a lot of her works. And she writes in Spanish at first, and her works then get translated into English. And primarily it's one woman named Margaret Seguri Pendon. And she's done all of her works except for one, which is the first book. And often she is called the world's most widely read Spanish language author, and thus has won numerous awards. For example, in 2010 she won Chile's most prestigious literary award, which is the National Literature Prize. Lastly, Island Beneath the Sea was published by Harper in the US in 2009, and like I said before, is translated by Margaret Sayers Pendon.
Specifically, I want to talk about how slavery is portrayed in Island Beneath the Sea as a decivilizing regime, I guess. And we really see that in this first section with the character of Toulouse Valmorain, because he gets to Haiti or Saint Domingue, I guess at this point, and he's like this young French Enlightenment guy who has all these humanistic ideals, and he just plans on being at the island for a little bit because it's so uncivilized. He can't wait to get back to France. But then he throughout this section, he just becomes more and more acculturated to the really brutal system of slavery in Haiti. He starts to sort of devolve or decivilize from that Enlightenment ideal to someone who is kind of a monster. So on page 83, you can really see how these Enlightenment ideals that he comes to the island with have not held up under being a slave master. When he's talking to the doctor and he's like, "You will not believe me, doctor, but before coming here, I admired Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau." But then after that, he talks about how he's lost his belief in humanism because he's like, that's not how it actually works. You can see how his ideals just don't stand up to the pressure of the slave regime.
Right, and as someone who's profiting from this system, of course he's not going to be for that. Why would he?
Yeah.
He's gaining so much by having slaves and seeing them as not human.
But he also tries to sort of distance himself from the bad things about slavery, and he uses his overseer, Prosper Cambrai, and he talks about having him do all of the punishment so that he can remain in the role of benevolent master, which is just bogus, because it doesn't matter if you're actually holding the whip. If you're the slave owner and it's because of you that they're getting punishment, you can see that process of brutalization happening even though he pretends that it's not. Valmorain represents sort of the metropole or France at this point, and how he has been trying, just like France, to distance himself from the effects of slavery and to contain that. They all try to pretend that this is all contained in the colony, and slavery is necessary because people want sugar. Yeah, right. But it's a bad thing that we'll just keep way over on the other side of the world, and it won't taint us or harm us. But you can see that even that dichotomy of oh, if we just keep it over there, it won't have any negative effects on us. That doesn't really work out, and you really see that in the character of Valmorain. Another example of the decivilizing effects of slavery can't be contained within the colonies is the history of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave. And it's really short, and it's really good, and you really should read it. It'll make you so angry. Mary Prince is taken to England by her owners, and even though she's in England, where at this time technically she's not a slave because there are no slaves in England at this point, she's still effectively a slave. They don't pay her. They have every intention of taking her back to Antigua and having her remain a slave. They coerce her, and they like keep pretending that they're gonna throw her out in the street and that she's gonna starve if she doesn't do what they say, and they like are really terrible to her. And so like even though she's in England, when everyone is talking about like how England is so free and like, oh, we're so great, we've abolished slavery in England, not in the colonies, and so everyone's like patting themselves on the back for like England is so wonderful, but like you can see a slave person is like taken from the colonies back to England, and her situation doesn't change very much until she finally escapes her owners. And so, like, you just can't contain that kind of negative effects in one place. That's like a false idea. In Discourse on Colonialism, Césaire argues that colonization turns the colonizer into something more beastly or inhuman. And so he's arguing that not only does colonization, or in our case in this book, slavery, have negative effects on the people who are enslaved or colonized, but that in fact it has negative effects on the colonizer, which is the same process that we see happening in Valmorin. And so he says, colonization dehumanizes even the most civilized man. Colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. That the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends to transform himself into an animal.
What?
So that's a perfect setup for Mayra to talk about some
great.
ego.
Yeah. So what Sophia was talking about in her section about the brutalizing effects of colonialism, not only on the oppressed, but the oppressor. We see this primarily through Toulouse, and he, in the beginning of the novel at least, represents this, French Enlightenment thinker who is a humanist. But the moment that he steps and inherits the plantation from his dad, when his dad dies, he is a master now, and we kind of see how his ideals of a humanist ideals and that all humans should be treated equally change, because he's in such a position of power and because he benefits from it. And mostly from an eco-crit perspective, in kind of contemporary eco-crit and ecofeminism, primarily right now, Black Vegans and Marjorie Spiegel, in her book, The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Slavery, have talked about not necessarily the equal oppression of humans and animals, but how they have similar oppressions because it's stemmed from the same patriarchal white man. Again, I don't want to say that they're equal, and I don't think Black vegans and the Black vegan movement or Spiegel is saying that. Rather, they want to point out that the oppressions and how that looks like between humans and animals have historically, and still to this day, are very similar, but not equal. Too, we see Toulouse being a humanist to being more pragmatic as far as like, this is the way the world works. We can't just destroy slavery because it's giving the world a good, it's good for the world economy. And he also is kind of in the position of power to say who is considered human and who's not. And so specifically, I kind of want to tie into what Spiegel is talking about in her book, The Dreaded Comparison, and what Aph and Syl, who are sisters, and they run a blog called Apro-ism and a part of the Black Vegan Rock movement. And I'll post their information in the description box. They kind of discuss in depth the comparative, though not equal, oppressions of Black slaves and animals from a historical point of view, and how that is manifested itself and transformed into new forms today. So specifically in this book, in page 83, with a chapter literally called A Being Not Human, Toulouse says, and he's talking to the doctor at this point, they're having a conversation about their different ideals. He says, it is obvious that you have had very few dealings with them being Black slaves. Blacks have the constitution for heavy work. They feel less pain and fatigue. Their brain power is limited. They do not know how to make choices. They're violent, disorderly, lay. They lack ambition and noble sentiments. And so Spiegel and what Aph Ko kind of talk about in their activism and in their works is I mean, this goes hand in hand with historically the treatment of animals, that animals don't feel pain. And we kind of see this through Descartes, who's kind of the one of the big thinkers in the Enlightenment. And
I think therefore I am, that guy.
Yeah, and he basically said that he doesn't believe animals have souls and that they don't feel pain, and that when you strike an animal, it's not because they feel pain, but rather it's the same kind of tune as a clock strikes at 12. It's an object. It's yeah. Anyways, so we can kind of see that Toulouse is kind of buying into this ideal, as far as equating, his black slaves with animals, to him at least. This whole chapter, title of Being Not Human, goes hand in hand with an eco-critical perspective. And then lastly, the last thing I want to talk about was another thing that Spiegel and Aph Ko talk about as far as an eco-feminist perspective, in that slavery, of course, commodifies bodies and thus oppresses those bodies. Specifically, I'm thinking of, and they made comparisons about how slave women, get brutalized and become pregnant, and then they have their children taken away from them because they're seen as property. And that we kind of see in today's, and not necessarily today's, but historically, the same kind of rhetoric in farm factoring, as far as cows who are artificially inseminated and to produce milk for human consumption, and then have their babies taken away from them. And we kind of see these same comparison in the book. For example, in the novel, Allende points out little Maurice was suckling like a calf at his wet nurse's breast. She's very aware of this historical context and this thing, right? And so I feel like she's trying to say this is what people would think about during this time, but she's also kind of implanting a seed of weight to the reader, the contemporary reader at least, of wait, this is bad, and this is really interesting because there are similarities, without explicitly kind of saying that they're different. I'm interested, as well as other eco-critical thinkers and ecofeminists, in the ways that the different oppressions stem from each other and intersect. Specifically in this section, I kind of see feminism, speciesism, and racism being a part of this whole system of slavery. Speciesism is a belief that different species of animals are significantly different from one another in their capacities to feel pleasure and pain, sound familiar, and live an autonomous existence, usually involving the idea that one's own species has the right to rule and use others. So just as much as this is obviously a racist thing, I think Allende is really interweaving the speciesist and racist ideology through Toulouse specifically, and just how intertwined they are. And it's really hard to parse it out, but it's there. And so I just think it's really interesting.
I totally agree. In the main chapters, you really get this 18th, 19th century perspective, and that Allende is doing a really great job of capturing that in a way that's really striking and sort of off-putting for a contemporary reader, when she incorporates that sort of language used by her characters, her descriptions of the landscape, and it's she's creating this world. She's really creating this 19th century world in a way that's really striking, and
I feel like it's purposeful. She's clearly knowledgeable of the way that people talked about slaves and slavery and as animals and as beasts, and of the landscape in need of being contained. And so she almost feels and I feel she reinforces those stereotypes in order to critique them, because clearly we don't see it that way anymore.
And especially I feel the critique is coming from the chapters in italics, the Zadite chapters, where we're getting Zadite's actual perspective in her own words, and those are such a striking contrast to the way that she's spoken about in the other chapters, that those I feel are creating this critique where she lays down, this is how people thought in the 18th and 19th century, and then she's this is what a slave woman really is like.
Right.
And so she's taking this decivilizing process with Toulouse, and then she's subverting it with sort of a civilizing process with Sarite, not that she's becoming civilized, but rather
She
that
has
the
more
reader,
agency.
yeah, the reader really gets to see these two characters sort of like switch places in this really interesting way. And so we're really curious to see what happens with that in the rest of the novel.
And we have so much more to say, so feel free to tune in. I created a Tumblr that will kind of go through what we talked about in our videos, but add in some more stuff that we couldn't just fit into it as far as the video. So feel free to check out the Tumblr. It's in the description box.
You can talk to us on Twitter, and we'll leave those links below. And be sure to comment, because we want to hear from you. So let us know what you think. Let us know if you're liking Island Beneath the Sea, and anything else you want us to talk about. And we'll maybe talk about it in our next video.
Thanks, guys.
Bye!